At the conclusion of the 2nd century Proto-Gospel of James, we read that the author James wrote it in Jerusalem. However, this appears highly unlikely. There are several errors which indicate that the author was in fact not very familiar with Jerusalem. For example, the author assumed that Zacharias, or Zechariah, was the high priest at the time of Mary and Joseph. However, this is clearly not the case. Francois Bavon notes that despite the Proto-Gospel of James, Zechariah is not the high priest, nor is he from the high priestly family. He is a simple priest. The priests of a given division officiate twice yearly in the temple for 1 week. For the rest of the year, Zechariah lives with his wife in the mountains of Judah, outside Jerusalem. The Proto-Gospel of James tells us a lot about Mary, the mother of Jesus, and similar to Samuel in the Old Testament, she goes to the temple to serve. However, the Proto-Gospel of James takes things a bit too far. Mary is taken to the temple at the age of 3, and she lives in the temple until she's 12. While there, she's fed miraculously by an angel. This late legendary gospel is very concerned for the purity of Mary, and so it has her grow up in the temple, and even her food is pure, brought to her by an angel. But there are some problems. Marcus Bachmuel states that the author of the Proto-Gospel of James seems at one level notably sympathetic to Palestinian Jewish piety, although only superficially and inaccurately acquainted with its particularities of belief and practice, or for that matter, even its geographic setting. There are, for example, some peculiar ideas about Jewish ritual and legal praxis, and the author seems a little unclear about whether Bethlehem is in Judea or outside it. He continues, readers sometimes wonder if there can be any kernel of historical reference here. Most scholars regard this infancy gospel as historically worthless, except as a source of 2nd century piety, and that does seem the safest point of departure. A standard critical objection to the notion of any early tradition here is that the document's knowledge of 1st century Judaism appears romantic and cliched, as well as full of wildly implausible factual errors about the realities of Jewish daily and religious life, and one of those in particular is Mary growing up in the temple. Bart Ehrman states that the Proto-Gospel of James focuses on Mary and provides legendary accounts, such as her sanctified upbringing in the Jerusalem temple. Parts of the book rely heavily on the infancy narratives of Matthew and Luke, but with numerous intriguing expansions, including legendary reports. And then he gives some examples. Stephen Davies says that the Gospel of James is not a historical account, but a set of legends. About Mary being raised in the temple, he says, it is inconceivable that a girl could really have been raised in the Holy of Holies. Thus, the Proto-Gospel of James is not a reliable source, unless you're the author of the Quran. What you see is Surah 3:35-37, and it should sound familiar. Zechariah took charge of Mary, and she was kept in the place of prayer, and miraculously provided with food. The Quran doesn't show any knowledge of the Jewish priesthood. That is, Zechariah is portrayed as a priest, but the Quran doesn't tell us what kind of priest he was. However, note that the Quran states that while Mary was growing up, it was Zechariah who cared for her, taking charge of her. However, this is problematic, as we've already heard. Since Zechariah was not a high priest, it's difficult to see how he could have been in charge of Mary's upbringing in the temple, since he was only there a small part of the year. This is incoherent. The Quran also borrows something else from the Proto-Gospel of James worth discussing here. The Proto-Gospel of James describes the priest taking rods from the men of Jerusalem into the temple. The priest then prayed, came back outside, and returned the rods to them. But Joseph took the last rod, and behold, a dove came out of the rod and flew onto Joseph's head. This is how Joseph was miraculously chosen to be Mary's caretaker. The Quran also describes how Mary's caretaker was miraculously selected. That is from the news of the unseen, which we reveal to you, O Muhammad. And you were not with them when they cast their pens, this is a foreign word, as to which of them should be responsible for Mary, nor were you with them when they disputed. So yes, the word for pens is yet another borrowed word in the clear Arabic Quran. Gabriel Reynolds notes, thus it emerges that with the term aqlam, the Quran does not intend pens, but rather rods. This, in fact, matches the primary meaning of kalam, a word derived from Greek kalamos, meaning reed. Let's look at some of the parallels between the Proto-Gospel of James and the Quran that we've seen so far. Mary is raised in the temple. Zechariah is the high priest, implied in the Quran. Mary is miraculously fed during her stay in the temple. When she moves out of the temple, her guardian is miraculously chosen using rods. Now, one thing that strikes me as very odd about all of this is the Quran's repeated claims to hidden knowledge. It's referred to as the unseen, which required revelation to be made known. That is one of the stories of the unseen. We inspired you with it. You were not with them when they cast their pens to see which one of them would take charge of Mary, nor were you with them when they were disputing. However, as numerous scholars have shown, the Proto-Gospel of James was very well known and very widely used. It was even translated into Syriac around the 5th century. If you're unsure why Syriac is important in Quranic studies, then see my video on Abraham and the Kaaba. The point here is that it's utter nonsense for the Quran to claim that this very well-known story is part of the unseen, requiring special revelation to know. On the contrary, the story was nothing new. So let's end with a bit of irony. We began by showing that the Proto-Gospel of James claims to be written by someone in Jerusalem. However, we know this was not the case, or if the author was in Jerusalem, he somehow managed to stay ignorant of some very important religious and geographical details. Ironically, the Quran makes a similar claim. It says to the messenger that the revelation is authentic, even though the messenger did not witness the events himself. Like the Proto-Gospel of James, the narrator of the Quran posits himself as a witness to the events and a trustworthy source. However, given that the Quran reproduces some of the same errors, we may conclude that, like the author of the Proto-Gospel of James, the narrator of the Quran wasn't there either. See you next time.